Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Moon Podcast. Now, this episode has been in the making for quite a long time. This video is about morals. How do we know what's right and wrong? Why do we feel so strongly about certain issues? How do we deal with dilemmas? This is a topic that I've been exploring for years, and I've been trying to make it into something simple and accessible. So it is with delight that I can say that I have finally succeeded. This is beneficial to our mental health as to enable us to expand our understanding of different perspectives. Plus, in this episode, I'm going to do something a little different. Usually, I leave my book reviews at the end of every episode to let you know where I got my information from. However, this time, I'm going to mention them in the beginning. After reading through some bad books as well as some mediocre ones, it is here that I recommend the best books on this topic and that I will refer to again and again as we explore the topic of morals. These books are The Origin of Morals by Dennis Krebs, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex by Charles Darwin, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, Moral Origins, Shame and Guilt by Christopher Boehm, Hierarchy in the Forest, also by Christopher Boehm, The Biology of Moral Systems by Richard Alexander, and Not by Genes Alone by Peter Richardson. So, let's begin. What are morals and where do they come from? No doubt, what also comes to mind are ethics, where some people think they are the same when they are actually two different things. So therefore, we need to make a clear distinction between them. Morals are about personal beliefs. Morality is a person's own ideas of what is right and wrong. Ethics are the beliefs of the community one lives in. Ethics are more concerned about what the group deems what is acceptable and what is right and wrong. Therefore, morals and ethics are not the same. You can read more about this in this article here on verywellmind.com. I'll put the link to that in the description below. One thing I observed is that I used to believe that morals came from people's upbringing. Our parents taught us how to behave since childhood, but not all parents raise their children the same way, and not every child grows up to be a well-adjusted human being. Not all adults are good parents either. Even if there were no parents involved, I thought maybe society played a role in a child's upbringing, like village elders or older relatives, to make sure children grew up and behaved in a way that certain cultures and societies expected of them. People are shaped by the world around them. This relates to what I talked about in a previous video about human history, about people being shaped by their environments. I'll put a link to that in the description below. People from different countries and cultures have different ideas of what morality is, so therefore exploring morals and what they are will enable us to build an understanding of the differences between us, thus improve our relationships and benefit our mental health. But it wasn't always the case that societies determine people's behavior. Despite social pressure, some people still struggle to become well-adjusted human beings. So therefore, maybe, well, in my younger days, and in my naivety, I thought maybe morality came from religion. Maybe if people practiced the same religions, read the same religious texts, participated in the same culture, then they will know what is right and wrong. Maybe the awareness of an omnipotent being and a good afterlife as a reward for a good life would deter bad behavior. But I was wrong. It goes deeper than that. Our sense of morals are older than that of human nature itself. One thing I noticed is that whenever someone or a group of people behaved in a way that was socially unacceptable, people would say things like, "Those animals," or "He acted like an animal." I chuckle at such scornful comments because when I observe the animal kingdom, I can see for myself that even animals have their own morals. The difference is, their brains are not as complex as ours, nor do they possess the language to communicate their morals to us or to each other. They simply evolved that way. This relates to what I talked about in a video about evolution. So go check it out. I'll put the link to that in the description below too. Some animals developed cooperation strategies in order to survive. such as the following. Bees have social hierarchies, like queen bees and worker bees, etc. Ants work in colonies. Gorillas need a strong dominant male in charge of family groups. Some animals claim territories and warn others to stay away in order to avoid conflict, thus setting boundaries. Such as wolves, they howl to maintain territories. In Cyprus, we have songbirds that sing to mark their territories and warn others, such as the Cyprus warbler, Cyprus wheater, and the Cyprus jay, to name a few. So clearly, morals are not purely a human construction. This is something ancient. Morals are something natural. So again, where did morals come from? Let's take a look at what morals are first. According to Dennis Krebs, morality has what he calls a moral domain. A domain as in an area of interest. What he means by this is that there are particular issues which people generally consider to be moral ones. For example, he uses it's speeding, for example, such as walking fast on the street is not a moral issue, but speeding in a vehicle on a road is immoral because you are putting other people's lives at risk. That's when it becomes a moral issue. I get where he's coming from. In his book, The Origins of Morality, he sets out the following forms of conduct. Obedience versus disobedience. Obeying rules over defiance. Self-control versus self-indulgence. Resisting temptation and delaying gratification over depravity. Altruism versus maliciousness. Caring for and helping others instead of harming or exploiting others. Fairness versus unfairness. Justice and equality over selfishness and nepotism. And of course, honesty versus dishonesty. Truthfulness and keeping promises over lying and cheating. Although these are fundamental moral issues, they culturally overlap each other. For example, Christianity has the 10 Commandments, and Confucius advocates the 5 virtues. However, Dennis Krebs is a psychologist, and so he is concerned with exploring what morality is from a scientific perspective. Using studies such as those conducted by Kolbe and Kohlberg, 1987, Krebs breaks down moral judgments into 6 stages, with people evolving through different stages during their lifetime as their views on moral conduct develop. These, in summary, are as followed. 1. Pre-conventional, where a person avoids breaking moral codes purely out of fear of punishment or social rebuke. The person is not morally developed, they are simply doing this out of social or legal necessity. 2. Individualism, where a person begins to choose which moral rules to abide by, often bending them to fit their own individual needs. 3. Conventional, where a person adheres to moral codes to a greater extent because they are concerned about how people will perceive their moral conduct. People are engaging more with what morality actually is at this stage. Number 4. Social systems and conscience, where people adhere more closely to moral codes because it not only makes them a more moral individual within their peer group, but also supports the wider moral system of a group or society. 5. Post-conventional or principled, where a person begins to engage in moral conduct out of a genuine desire to act in a moral manner. Social pressures are of less consequence, and the desire to actually be a moral person becomes stronger. And 6. Universal ethical practices, or principles, where a person reaches a mature moral stance and strives to behave ethically for its own sake. According to Dennis Krebs, different societies place different emphasis on different levels. Some societies are primarily interested in the less developed earlier levels. They simply want people to obey basic moral prescriptions because that is what they have been told to do so. But from Charles Darwin's perspective, most people would have evolved to view morality from the perspective of levels 5 and 6. Dennis Krebs states that we need to be aware of what the purposes of morality is in any given society. Groups develop ideas about morality in order to benefit their society as a whole. Sometimes I find myself wondering, are we humans really that bad that we need rules in order to behave ourselves? One thing I learned is that some people think that we do. I'll return to this again shortly. When we reward good behavior, it will continue. When we punish bad behavior, it will deter us from repeating it. It's like a feedback loop. We don't want to be ostracized because deep down we feel a sense of empathy. We don't want to lose any social connection because, after all, we don't live alone. As a side note, this reminds me of B.F. Skinner's mouse experiments on operant conditioning. It's about the learning process where behaviors are influenced by consequences. Positive reinforcement encourages a behavior by adding a reward, while negative reinforcement strengthens it by removing an unpleasant stimulus. Punishment, on the other hand, decreases a behavior by introducing a negative consequence or removing a positive one. So basically, when a mouse did something good, it was rewarded with food, but when it did something bad, it was electrocuted. That way it was conditioned into good behavior. This is why we dread punishment and seek everyone's approval. This is why punishments must be immediate, consistent, proportionate, paired with positive reinforcement of alternative behaviors, and accompanied by clear communication about desired behaviors. That way, people can adjust their behaviors in order to live and function in a society properly. I'll leave the link to this article about operant conditioning in the description below. Now, getting back to the evolution of morals. Some evolutionary theorists believe that we are immoral by nature. Their argument is we would do anything necessary for our own selfish interests. For example, if there is a food shortage, a person who steals the food from others is more likely to survive, while other evolutionary theorists argue otherwise. But why do we need morals and rules in the first place? Is it because we are bad by nature? The answer is no. You may be asking, how? When we give to charity, such as donating money or blood to those who need it, it's usually done anonymously. Usually, nobody knows that we give to charity, and the recipient doesn't know who donated to them. This alone is evidence that we are naturally more altruistic than selfish. The argument that George Williams posits is that modern human beings, just like in the animal kingdom, are prone to violence and immoral conduct in order to benefit themselves in evolutionary terms. But Richard Dawkins counters this argument by stating that altruism is something which human beings became socialized to engage in as we evolved as a species. He also adds, based on Charles Darwin's own writings, that evolution is not always linear and logical. Sometimes altruism emerges over selfishness, and this can happen for a range of reasons. People will often act in altruistic moral ways because it facilitates their own biological needs in one way, or because of some other important biological or environmental reason. Once again, this goes back to what I talked about in a previous video, where people are shaped by the world around them. In other words, environmental determinism. Charles Darwin wrote a book called The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. In one chapter, Darwin claimed that morality evolved in 4 stages. Firstly, humans realized early on that within a social setting it was wise to try and win social approval by engaging in moral or ethical behavior. Secondly, the selfish of human beings clashed with this social imperative and led to the development of what we call a conscience. Thirdly, as human societies evolved, we developed a more nuanced understanding of what morality was and how to express it. Fourthly, and finally, morality became ingrained into society and passed down from generation to generation. Dennis Krebs expands upon this. For instance, starting with the first stage, part of the reason why we might act morally in a social setting is out of an ability to feel sympathy. For example, if we see somebody suffering from the cold or hunger, we often feel sympathy for them and help them. Similarly, we might act in a moral manner out of a desire for approval. This is what Dennis Krebs calls the acquisition of social instincts. For the second stage, that Dennis Krebs calls is the evolution of conscience. Here, he notes that Charles Darwin raised a fundamental issue about how conscience operates. A person will often feel regret in a situation where they did not help someone else, even if doing so would have placed them in harm's way. From an evolutionary perspective, it makes no sense to feel regret, and yet humans do. Darwin concluded that this force of conscience was to do with socialization, to feel that we should have intervened in a way which would generate social approval. As time went by, we developed moral habits. The ways we express our need for social approval became more refined. We ask ourselves, what if everyone behaved the same way I am behaving, before doing anything? According to Dennis Krebs, there were 3 stages to which our morals evolved: instinctive, evolutionary, and social. This is how cooperative behavior among humans shaped morality. It was nuanced, rather than linear. This is why we have so many perspectives. This is why not everyone thinks the same way. According to Krebs, this is a useful counterargument to modern evolutionary biologists who place too much emphasis on the self-interest of humans and other animals. We are not entirely selfish, otherwise we would never cooperate with others in order to survive. Getting back to the 3 stages of how morals evolved: instinctive, evolutionary, and social. Instinct is determined by genes, personal traits that were passed on from parents to offspring. In order to do so, instead of relying on brute force on others, social cooperation was developed in order to survive and procreate. This developed social selection, which is how we evolved. Once we evolved into social beings, we began to develop social conflicts among ourselves to resolve issues, such as conflicts of interest, social dilemmas, and strategic interactions in the evolution of morality. Social strategies evolved and impacted our moral evolution over time. But this raises the question about genes. It's not enough to just hold genes accountable for how we turned out. Genes do not create behaviors out of nowhere. What needs to be taken into account is the environment in which our genes were shaped by, which determined its evolution. Once again, animals and people are shaped by the world around them. Although we have agency, our genes responded accordingly to our environments. One thing we developed is something called deference. In this case, by deference, Dennis Krebs means the manner in which people defer to authority. Children obey their parents, and adults obey authorities such as the law, the government, and other institutions. This is because it is believed that those in charge have the moral authority for safety as well as agreed distribution of resources. Animals and humans developed an entrenched hierarchy where it is clear who is on top. That way there is an agreed code of conduct. Thus, there is no need to fight over resources every time. Otherwise, it would be a waste of time and energy. This creates a balance between authority figures and the subordinates. This creates social order. Krebs got this idea from anthropologist Christopher Boehm in his book Hierarchy in the Forest: The Evolution of Egalitarian Behavior. Morality, according to Christopher Boehm, quote, evolved to enable people to maximize their gains from group living, and that to accomplish this, individuals must enforce the implicit or explicit rules that uphold the social orders of their groups, end quote. But this raises another question. If morality developed as a means of social cooperation, then why do people individually still do moral things even when there is no one around to see them? This is where we find the next component of our moral evolution. It's called self-control. Self-control is basically the ability to delay one's personal gratification for long-term gain. For example, if a person in a hunter-gatherer society thousands of years ago had collected a certain amount of food, they could gorge themselves on it and have a short-term gratification of their hunger. but the long-term strategy from an evolutionary perspective would be to conserve some of their food supply against shortages later. From an evolutionary perspective, a mammal that exercises self-control is better primed to survive in this context. Failure to exercise self-control is immoral. Self-control developed in children and adults, and yet there are individual differences. One of the key distinctions between being a child and being an adult is that children generally exercise little self-control, while adults are expected to be much more self-controlled. When adults fail to exercise self-control, it is deemed to be a major character flaw, and we define such people today as having an illness. For example, alcoholism, or drug addiction, or sex addiction, etc. When children are taught self-control to delay gratification, they become less well adapted as adults. The second key distinction Dennis Krebs provides is an evolutionary account of self-control. The degree to which some individuals are possessed of greater powers of self-control is determined to some extent by our genes. There are always pluses and minuses to these from an evolutionary perspective. Getting back to the hunter-gatherer society I mentioned earlier, sure, there may be a biological impulse to mate as much as possible in order to create as many offspring as possible to maximize the possibility of one's genetic line continuing. This is a biological impulse which favors a lack of self-control. If, in this case, it's beneficial, then why would lust be considered immoral? The answer lies in the evolutionary strategy that it not only counters it but complements it. If a person has too many offspring, then they are faced with the additional problem of how to support all of them. From a hunter-gatherer perspective, this would have led to resource scarcity if there were too many mouths to feed. Thus, there is always a push and pull with self-control. Sometimes a lack of self-control is a positive from an evolutionary perspective, but in nearly all instances, if taken to an extreme, any action can become counterproductive. This in part explains why such traits like gluttony or lust are negative from an evolutionary and a survival perspective. So now we move on to the evolution of altruism through sexual selection. Or, to put it more bluntly, how does altruism evolve in humans if being selfish is a better strategy to survive and reproduce? In trying to answer this, Krebs focuses on the idea that sexual selection offsets the more primitive evolutionary prioritization of selfishness. Basically, while being selfish is a useful survival instinct, people are more attracted to people who are also altruistic as potential mates. Thus, altruism proliferated through sexual selection. According to Krebs, there are 4 types of altruism: sexually selected altruism, kin-selected altruism, group-selected altruism, and maladaptive altruism. In a nutshell, altruism is the behavior we have developed in order to cooperate with others. For sexual selection, the males have to provide and the females have to take care of their offspring. Kin-selected altruism is how we interact with immediate kin and closely related family members. Group-selected altruism is what drives us to serve our society as a whole, as well as how they interact with us. Every animal and human being plays an important role for other members of the same species. Hence, altruism became deeply entrenched in our evolution. However, what is maladaptive altruism? I'll return to that shortly, on which I will elaborate further. Now, this raises a question about altruism in the group selection. Why do some animals and humans sacrifice themselves for the group when they gain nothing in return? One example we can use to explain this is lions. Dennis Krebs cites a study by D.S. Wilson where he observed a pride of lions. He observed that a pride of lions would consistently be the first to place themselves in harm's way when a rival group of lions tried to encroach into their territory. It was also revealed that the altruistic lions that placed themselves in harm's way did not seem to acquire any benefits from doing so. For example, they did not have greater mating opportunities and the like as a result of their increased role in protecting the pride. In the short term, the actions of the altruistic lions who stepped up to protect the pride's territory would lead to the pride having a much better chance of surviving over a pride, where if everyone acted in a selfish manner and lost their territory as a result. However, in the long run, the chances are that the group would become more selfish as more selfish members survived for longer within it and became dominant. This strange phenomenon is known as maladaptive altruism, where an unusual act such as sacrificing selfishness completely and placing oneself in danger for the well-being of the group has nothing to gain from it. The whole point is to preserve the group. This is why men sacrifice themselves by going to war, so that their group can thrive. From their perspective, sacrificing their lives is not only an altruistic act for the well-being of their group, their kin and sexual mates, but it enables their group to survive. Animals and humans alike, the group with such level of a maladaptive altruism is more likely to survive than a group that does not have it. It's a long-term strategy for the group. As mentioned earlier, evolution is not linear, nor is it entirely logical. It is imperfect and illogical, and this maladaptive form of altruism is one of its mechanisms. This may sound bizarre, but this kind of altruism is indeed moral, because it is beneficial to the group it serves. Speaking of groups, we now turn to the evolution of cooperation. As animals, we learned to survive by cooperating in a group rather than being selfish. That way we depend on each other. It was logical for human beings very early on in their development to begin cooperating with one another in order to prosper. Those who did so stood a better chance of surviving and evolving. Simply put, a group of a dozen humans hunting and gathering together and sharing their resources were going to survive longer than a single human being going it alone. Cooperation both fostered altruism and was more likely to occur in those who were more naturally altruistic, and so altruism was given an evolutionary advantage through cooperation. All of this may sound straightforward and logical, but it gets more complicated than that. For example, we have this thing called tit for tat, which is cooperation strategy. It basically means we do favors for each other in the hope that someone will do something for us in return, even though we don't specifically say things like, I have done this and that for you, or something like, I have done this number of favors for you, so therefore you have to do this for me. We still have a common agreement among ourselves. We also have this thing called concrete reciprocity, or delayed reciprocity, which occurs when a favor is repaid at a later time. Not all favors are exchanged instantly. As Richard Dawkins once said, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. So, for example, if there is to be a food shortage, the members of a group will mutually agree to try and conserve them in their collective interest of survival. The concept of sharing and turn-taking also evolved as strategies of cooperation. Hence, the evolution of cooperation became the sharing and taking turns. However, there is something else to take into consideration. There are people among us who are more selfish than others. There are those who also pretend to be more cooperative than they are in fact, and are in order to extract benefits from others. Henceforth, this is why we evolved methods of detecting when other members of a group are not being genuine in their cooperation or not. Hence, skepticism evolved along with trust. There is also a health benefit to cooperation. There are long-term benefits that arrive through long-term social investments among humans and animals that can effectively result in social interactions akin to friendship over time. There is even a health gain to this form of cooperation and the altruism which it might foster. Modern human beings who are more isolated and less sociable, for instance, tend to suffer from higher blood pressure, sleep disorders, and other problems. Hence, there are health benefits to friendship and social cooperation. Now we move on to the psychological and neurological sources of primitive pro-social behaviors. It is here we discuss how the primitive forms of altruism and pro-social behavior that led to the development of morality in the long run evolved. As a result, we have developed pro-social behaviors that have neurological and psychological roots. Here we explore a range of mechanisms that produce primitive emotional reactions. There is empathy and sympathy, which I think requires making a clear distinction between the two. Empathy is the ability to experience other people's feelings. It involves putting yourself in other people's positions. It's about listening without judgment. Empathy requires an emotional component of really feeling what the other person is feeling. Sympathy is understanding other people's suffering. By contrast, sympathy involves understanding from your own perspective. Sympathy can lead to giving unsolicited advice and passing judgment. Sympathy is more cognitive and maintains a certain distance. For example, I can sympathize with a homeless person, but I cannot empathize with them because I have not experienced it. I've never been in that position before. The only thing I can do is donate money or give them advice on what to do about their situation. I am not emotionally involved. On the other hand, I can empathize with someone who is heartbroken from a relationship that has ended because I know what it feels like. Because I've been in that position before, so I know what it feels like to suffer from a heartbreak. I listen to people who have been through it, that way they don't feel alone. People want to be heard. My presence and willingness to listen makes them think I care. And, in a way, I do. There is also the following behaviors too: love and solidarity. Love is a strong emotion that makes people care and be altruistic towards one another. This relates to another topic I talked about in another video, about love as will. Solidarity is basically people putting their differences aside to come together for mutual feeling about something, without any expectations of receiving anything in return. There are also emotional impulses towards cooperation with others in ways that produce altruism. Pride can in some instances lead people to act altruistically towards others out of a sense of collective pride. Gratitude can lead to people to act altruistically towards others. It's when you give back to others without expecting anything in return. Then there is anger and indignation. It is here we need to distinguish the two. Anger is a negative emotional response. Anger is more personal and not always related to social contexts. Anger is often seen as more intense and potentially less controlled. Anger is typically more personal and directly related to one's own experiences. Anger may result in more varied responses, from aggression to passive-aggressive behavior. Anger can be triggered by various personal or impersonal situations. Indignation is more of a judgmental response involving disapproval or blame for someone else's actions. Indignation is considered a social emotion, often involving judgments about societal norms and expectations. Indignation is generally viewed as a more measured response. Indignation is described as a steely form of anger, that is, more intentional and less impulsive. Indignation can be felt about situations that don't directly involve the person experiencing the emotion, such as injustices happening to others or in distant places. Indignation often leads to a desire to inform others about the perceived wrongdoing or to seek justice. Indignation is specifically provoked by perceived injustice or unfairness. For example, I get very angry when people are rude and don't behave in a polite manner or do as they are told. So then I sometimes tend to get confrontational until the problem is resolved, or I just curse to make myself feel better. When it comes to indignation, I simply distance myself from people whose behaviors I don't approve of. Or, to express my discontent for the biggest companies, I simply boycott them for the way they treat their customers, their workers, and for the low quality of products and services. And I buy from independent small businesses, engaging in counterculture. That is a form of indignation. The last three mechanisms are forms of emotion that lead people to act altruistically in order to seek some form of absolution: guilt, shame, and forgiveness. Again, we need to make clear distinction between guilt and shame before we move on to forgiveness. Guilt focuses on a specific behavior. Guilt involves feeling bad about an action. Guilt can lead to positive changes and reparative behavior. Guilt typically doesn't affect one's core sense of self-worth. Shame focuses on the entirety of the self. Shame involves feeling bad about oneself as a person. Shame often results in withdrawal and potentially harmful behaviors. Shame can significantly impact an individual's self-esteem. While both guilt and shame can be challenging, shame is more strongly associated with various mental health conditions and can have more severe psychological impacts. So now we come to the final pro-social emotional mechanism, forgiveness. The drive towards seeking forgiveness when we do wrong is something which has been revealed to be universal to almost all primates. It is a powerful emotive drive towards moral behavior in human beings. All these emotions have an adaptive function, quote, to dispose people to behave in inclusive fitness increasing ways, end quote. So now we move on to the evolution of uniquely human pro-social behaviors. When we look at the works of a number of anthropologists and evolutionary biologists, specifically Christopher Boehm, Richard Alexander and Peter Richardson and Robert Boyd, the question their work poses is quite precise. Early human groups were structured in much the same way as primates. However, at some stage over the last 100,000 years, and in particular in the last 10,000 years, quote, something happened that caused humans to cooperate in large, complex, symbolically marked groups, end quote. Once this is acknowledged, the question follows, what caused this radical divergence with other social animals? As humans, over the course of time, we have gone from egalitarian species to a hierarchical species. This transition developed alongside our change from a hunter-gatherer society to a hierarchy with a smaller dominant group. With a smaller dominant group in charge of the larger group, it makes it easier to distribute resources. This goes back to what I talked about in my previous videos about environmental determinism and evolution. Once again, people are shaped by the world around them. According to a study conducted by Richardson and Boyd in 2005, they found that the idea that pro-social human behaviors evolved as a result of a complex model of cultural group selection. Their argument is that modern humans continue to evolve in much the same way as primates until a few thousand years ago. Then, humans acquired the ability to create, communicate, and refine cultural ideas in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China. As they did so, their ideas concerning cultural norms changed, and this led to a shift in the social understanding of what is right and wrong. So yes, when a civilization has strong connections, united with the same values, they survive, and they are much stronger than those without. When a civilization has firm understanding of what is right and wrong, common values give them a strong sense of unity. Over time, from an evolutionary perspective, groups that tended to have a firmer sense of their shared cultural values outcompeted others. Thus, there was a kind of cultural and genetic arms race which saw the development of societies in which humans who were more cooperative and pro-social tended to triumph. In a sense, this could be defined as a kind of cultural natural selection which tended to favor pro-social groups. This later became a genetic arms race. Humans with more cooperation and more pro-social behaviors triumphed over those that didn't. Eventually, we developed a sort of tribal instinct where small tribes of people developed into city-states, then from kingdoms to empires. Hence, cultures are created differently based on their environments. But what about psychology and neurology? In what way do they influence pro-social behavior? Now that we have examined societal reasons for the development of pro-social behaviors, this is where we return to Charles Darwin in his exploration of cognitive abilities and reasoning. We have larger brains than our primate ancestors. One of the key elements of our neurological evolution is that the brains of human beings are quite larger than those of other mammals. For instance, the average chimpanzee brain is 450 cubic centimeters, while those of the average modern human are nearly 3 times this size, between 1,250 and 1,350 cubic centimeters. These larger brains contain 20 to 30 billion neurons, which allow us to perform billions of operations per second, only a tiny fraction of which we are actually aware of. The exact reason why we evolved to have larger brains is unclear. Regardless, this enabled us to develop empathy and cooperation, convert thoughts into language. The larger brain enabled us to develop complex mechanisms. He then itemizes what some of these mental mechanisms are, as follows. Social learning abilities. We have the ability to categorize the behavior seen in others. There is memory. Our advanced memories have allowed us to adopt enduring social instincts which have impacted our approach to prosocial behavior. We also have the ability to form complex cognitive representations. This is associated with our ability to engage in things like delayed gratification, as I mentioned earlier. Mental stimulation, prediction and planning. These are our prosocial behaviors. They can be impacted by how we predict the actions of how others and how we plan and strategize various things. There is reason. Perhaps the most foremost thing which distinguishes us from other mammals is our advanced capacity for reason and logic. As reason evolved, it probably gave rise to our ability to see that prosocial behaviors were a better course of action in most situations for a variety of reasons. There is empathy, which I also mentioned earlier, the ability to put ourselves in other people's positions. There is insight and metacognitive thinking. This relates to our ability to reflect on our own actions and adapt our future behavior. There is language, of course. Yes, language. Finally, the manner in which language developed dictated our ability to communicate ideas about prosocial behavior, not just with one another, but from generation to generation. These are clear indicators that we have fully developed brains. We humans are among the most complex creatures living on Earth with the most complex of brains. And there we have it, the origin of morals and where they came from. Morality is a complex interplay of instinct, evolution, socialization, and environment. While personal and societal influences are important, the roots of morality are deep, ancient, and observable across species. Understanding these origins can foster empathy and help bridge cultural differences. Doing so will help us understand each other better and make the world a better place. Morality developed in us naturally as we evolved. This by itself is a result of natural law, which I also talked about in another episode. Our morals are not perfect, but they are still improving. It has taken many years and generations for us to develop our morals in order for us to come this far. Through trial and error, we went from one extreme to the next. As we can see, it requires balance. Regardless, we are still making errors while making corrections as we go along in a single direction. The yin and yang, two forces working in tandem with one another. Our senses of right and wrong are constantly changing. Again, this relates to what I talked about in regards to natural law. The yin-yang and Mother Nature. I'll put the link to that in the video description below. Eventually, I say with hope, there will come a time when we will be more cooperative and understanding of one another. If we have to make morally questionable decisions along the way, then so be it. We are still evolving. Change is constant, and adapting to constant change is not easy. In a nutshell, morals came as a result of millions of years of evolution to enable us to survive, cooperate, and make decisions that not only benefits us, but our loved ones as well as our communities. We all want fairness, a sense of justice. Hopefully, while we are still evolving, we can make better decisions to help us shape a better future. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found this episode enlightening. Take good care of yourselves.